On va commencer, même en anglais. Vous allez m'excuser pour mon anglais très exotique, mais c'est Isabelle qui m'oblige à parler en anglais. Alors, distinguished guests, estimate colleagues, and dear friends, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this important conference, From Revolution to Exile, Arab Diaspora Politics in a Post-2011 Context. On behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Study, I extend my sincere gratitude to all participants who have joined us today to engage in this crucial discussion. We are also honored to have organized this event in partnership with the Arab Reform Initiative, whose commitment to understanding and addressing the complexities of Arab political transformation has been invaluable. I have myself been part of this endeavor for 10 years, and I have today a special thought for my late colleague and friend Basma Kudmani, who has extensively worked on the Palestinian and the Syrian diaspora. Over the past decade, we have witnessed seismic shifts in the political, social, and humanitarian landscape of the Arab world. The Arab uprisings of 2011 ignited waves of hope, calls for justice, and demands for change. Yet, as the years unfold, this aspiration encountered formidable challenges, forcing many activities, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens into exile. Today, in the Arab diaspora, is not of homeland politics. It has become a crucial actor in shaping transnational political struggles, influencing country politics, sustaining the voices of those who remain unheard in their country of origin. The Arab Center for Research and Policy Study has been keen to organize this event precisely because the question of diaspora politics is not only an academic or theoretical issue, not very exotic. It is a lived reality that has profound implication for the future of political movements, state-society relations, and the broader trajectory of democratization in the region. As scholars and practitioners, we must interrogate the shifting dynamic of exile, transnational activism, and the evolving role of the Arab diaspora in light of recent development. This conference brings together esteemed researchers who have dedicated their work to understanding the complexities of Arab diaspora politics. Their contribution will provide invaluable insight into the ways in which exile communities navigate political engagement, identity, and advocacy across different contexts. In this regard, the evolving situation of the Syrian diaspora following the event of December 8 marks a particular critical moment. The Syrian community in exile has long been at the forefront of political and humanitarian mobilization, navigating between the challenges of displacement and the urgent need to sustain political agency. The post-December 8 context has introduced new dilemmas, from the pressures of normalization effort to the changing international stance on Syrian refugees and opposition figures. This development compels us to resist the strategies of the Syrian diaspora, as well as the broader Arab exile communities in their quest for justice, accountability, and long-term political influence. As we embark on this one-day conference, I encourage each of you to engage in open and thought-provoking discussion. Our aim is not only to analyze the past, but also to envision pathways for the future. Pathways that uphold the principles of dignity, right, and justice for all those who continue to struggle for a better tomorrow. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the organizing committee of this conference. Fanny Christou, researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Sarah Anna Ring, Deputy Director at the Arab Reform Initiative, and Isabel Rook, Head of Research of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Their dedication and hard work have been instrumental in bringing this important event to fruition. Additionally, appreciate have supported this event, the School of Oriental and African Study of the University of London, the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, the American Graduate School in Paris, and the European Institute of the Mediterranean in Barcelona. Their support has been invaluable in this conference. Once again, I thank you all for being here today and look forward to the insight and perspectives you will bring to this vital conversation. I will now leave the floor to my friend Nadim Houri, Director of the Arab Reform Initiative.
Good morning, and thank you, Salam, for this introduction. Let me start first by thanking you and thanking the team at CAREP for your partnership and for hosting us today. I also really want to thank the organizing committee, Fanny, Isabel, Sarah. They really did all the hard work. I feel I'm a fraud, frankly, this morning sitting here, but I'm glad to be starting this conversation because it's a subject that I care a lot about, myself being twice diaspora. But also when the team started working on this conference, it was always a timely issue, but it has never been as timely. Salam already mentioned it. What we're seeing now, and I think as a researcher, it must be a very exciting moment because this title is From Revolution to Exile, but in the case of Syrians, it's what? From revolution to exile to what? To return to the homeland. How do we understand this? Is it we're seeing that most people, there's a form of pilgrimage, I'm calling it the Hajj to Damascus, that we're seeing with rituals that are developing, and this has just been unfolding the last few weeks about the drive from Beirut or now the flights from Qatar, the kiss the ground, which cafe you go to, who do you go see, who do you meet, the sort of use of social media to share this, the legitimacy this ascribes. Very, interesting, rich material that we're seeing unfold before. But also rich because we have comparative examples, recent comparative examples. How will the Syrian diaspora's role be different than what we saw from the Iraqi and Libyan diasporas? Very different dynamics. So I really felt actually, even though we hadn't planned it initially that way, this topic could not be more timely, relevant. And I want to leave you perhaps with 4 very quick dimensions. So obviously the first one is better understanding, and I know that, the diasporas from the diaspora perspective, in light of these changes. Seeing the reformation perhaps of a Tunisian diaspora, given by the repression that is happening in Tunis. Will this diaspora be similar to what we saw in the past, the formation of human rights activists in Tunisian human rights activists in exile, many of them in this country? Will we see something different? How are we seeing the exile of supposedly the young tech entrepreneurs Will they remain politically active or turn the page? There's also another diaspora that has emerged as a key player. It's the Palestinian Arab diaspora on Gaza. Also, be it in the US and all suddenly the focus, everyone discovered Dearborn, Michigan after all these years. But also the difference between the capacity of that diaspora to express itself in the US versus its capacity to express itself in Europe. So really kind of a very rich field of study about the diasporas themselves. And I'll talk about the diaspora that I come from, the Lebanese diaspora, and which has had since 2019 a sort of transnational activism. And the symbolic, the current prime minister designate, Nawaf Salam, and the idea that he actually took a plane to go back to accept the designation. He wasn't living in Lebanon, and how his team and people around him are a mix between people who stayed in Lebanon and those who they don't maybe not consider themselves as exile, but his little, where are they? What are they? So really kind of very, very rich moment. And perhaps what we're seeing is sort of another episode most dramatically comprised by Syria. The second one is what will the impact be on their home countries? So it's been very striking, again, talking about Syria, to see you actually have better luck meeting Ahmed al-Shaba, aka al-Julani, if you're part of the Syrian diaspora, as opposed to if you are a Syrian from Syria, right? There is this new group of the Syrian billionaires. They get the VIP treatment. They get immediately the appointment. But it was very interesting, for instance, that al-Shaba accepted to meet with Syrian women from the diaspora before he actually met any Syrian women from Syria. So very interesting dynamics about how the role of the diaspora is shaping up. We keep seeing delegations of Syrians from the US, Syrians from Europe, going to Damascus as part of this pilgrimage. At the same time, many people are not taking a one-way ticket. A lot of it is sort of they're dipping their toes. What will the influence be on the politics, and how do we compare it, for instance, this diaspora that has carried for a long time notions of accountability, justice, through their work in Europe and North America on sanctions against the old regime, on universal jurisdiction cases, on ICC referrals, preparing files, and now having to navigate what that impact will be in terms of Syria's own approach to accountability. So I think very interesting to explore that effect. And then the third dimension, I think, which we'll probably discuss, is how host countries are thinking of these diasporas. And there as well, the last month and a half have been quite striking. So one could have imagined that when it comes to European countries who have hosted so many Syrians, notably places like Germany and so forth, a Europe that is actually looking to build new alliances across the Mediterranean as it feels isolated between, a more brutal US and China, Russia, and so forth, would be using these diasporas as soft power. But that's not what we're seeing. We're actually seeing Europe rushing. I mean, it's very ironic. Before Assad fell, they were saying, Syria is safe, you should go back to Syria. Assad fell, the discourse stayed the same. Syria is safe, you should go back to Syria. And they almost rushed to cancel people's refugee applications and so forth, not thinking that actually, thinking of the diaspora as a burden at the moment when one could argue the diaspora could be a key bridge and a key asset. So it's very interesting how some of these countries have, and how this is going to impact the politics of the host countries. I could have thought that maybe it would reduce the level of anxiety amongst host countries, that maybe Syrians will eventually go back, but it will take some time and it will be back and forth. But we're actually not at all seeing that. And also when we think about host countries, which host countries and their strategies, there's been so much focus on communities in the West. But it's also interesting perhaps to look at, again, if we think about the Syrians in Turkey, and how Turkey is approaching this Syrian, which often it's interesting as well how we use words. We think of them as Syrian refugees and not Syrian diaspora, but ironically, they're as diasporic as Syrians in Germany or Syrians in France. So I think really very, very rich terrain, I think, for us to explore. And I totally agree with Salam, not just looking back, but looking at the present and thinking about the future. And I want to conclude with our last observation, having worked myself with Sarah for years now and thinking about diasporic politics and the research on diasporas. There's been a real disconnect and inability to connect the research agenda with the diaspora communities themselves. The sort of questions one often fascinating research question one reads about, particularly coming out of academia, don't tend to resonate very much with the diaspora communities themselves. Often there's been something missing in translation, I would argue. Maybe not. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how, maybe some of you might challenge this today, but some of the research questions and how they see it and what is being shared back with them and how do you reach them, in our view, at least, in my view, I should say, has been a challenge. How do you reach the diaspora? How do you feed back? What do they find useful in terms of themselves better understanding their points of view and their politics? And I hope this is a tension point, I would argue, that maybe we can discuss today as we think forward. What is the research agenda that is useful today as well for some of these diaspora communities? And are they not only the objects of our research, but are they also the intended recipients of our research? Maybe yes, maybe no, and I'm sure there are different perspectives, but I just wanted to leave you with that, with what I think is a tension point. So again, thank you very much. Bon travail for today, and thank you again to CAREP. I'll hand the floor now to my colleague, Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank CAREP as well as my co-organizers, Fanny and Isabelle, for this day. It's really exciting and fun to see all these people in the audience that I've gotten the chance to work with over the years and to reconnect in this way. So the title of my presentation is What is New About Post-2011 MENA Diasporas? And it is based on research that was carried out by the Arab Reform Initiative with several of our speakers today, Ola and Hoda in particular. So I'll be drawing on that. And what I'm hoping to do, these are just going to be brief remarks, is to provide some reflections on what we can identify as new in the post-2011 diaspora formation processes and mobilization processes. There's, of course, been historic diasporas from the region, but what is different since 2011? I want to explore a little bit the relationship between the context in the region since 2011 and how that is informing these changes and transformations within the diasporas, and some of the new research questions that this could open up and further avenues of investigation. So the classic conceptualizations or definitions of diaspora define it as dispersed, extraterritorial, and imagined communities that share some form of collective sense of belonging or identification with a common or shared homeland, and that participate in some form of reproduction of the home or the nation. And they also argue these classic ideas that diaspora mobilization is perhaps primarily undertaken for the purpose of influencing homeland political dynamics. But when we look at the 2011 diasporas, all the diaspora, all the people who have come into exile or migration since 2011, we see that those classic definitions fall somewhat short. And I'd like to argue that there are perhaps two notable differences. And the first is in the nature of diaspora, sort of their character, and the second is in the forms and directions of political engagement since 2011. So taking the first, we see that since 2011, there's been a really important diversification and pluralization in the character of the diasporas. We can no longer speak of a diaspora, an Iraqi diaspora or a Libyan diaspora, but diasporas. We really need to talk about it in the plural. We see, for example, that how these So when we take, for example, the case of Libya, there's a historic Libyan diaspora. This is not something new since 2011. But with 2011 and the various ways the context has changed, the ways the political dynamics, the reversals of power, who is in power, when, revolutionary, counter-revolutionary dynamics, conflict dynamics. We have different waves of departure. There's a wave in 2011 and a different wave in 2014. And those profiles of those who went into diaspora, went into exile at those times are quite different. 2011 might be more of the pro-Gaddafi, whereas 2014, more of the revolutionary activists, for example. So we see this diversification in who is going into exile and when they are going into exile that is directly related to the political and conflict dynamics in the region. We also see that whereas before, maybe a lot of the people going into exile would have been anti-regime, they were seeking safe harbor from the regimes or economic stability. Because of these repeated reversals of power, these revolutionary, counter-revolutionary dynamics and how conflict dynamics have unfolded in the region, that we have quite a different level of political capital that has emerged in the diaspora. So for example, there might be many people who actually had been part of former regimes or had been somehow related to structures of power that have gone out, that have left. They come with a certain degree of political capital, political knowledge and know-how, as well as different political access points. We all know that many revolutionary activists have also left since then. They also come with different degrees in different forms of political capital, different resources, material and immaterial, that they can mobilize. So all this creates quite a diversification in terms of what types of political capital, what types of political access points people in the diaspora have and how that can be utilized. And finally, we have a diversification in terms of the geographic destinations. The historic places of diaspora, the historic communities, continue to be important for obvious reasons. It's obviously easier to go someplace where there's already existing community. But we also see that some of the close neighboring states, neighboring cities become more important places of diaspora. And this has to do with patterns of circular migration, as well as for many people, there was not necessarily an anticipation of staying in exile for a very long time. So there's always the anticipation of going back. But we also see that there's some new sites that have cropped up and that have become quite important in many cases, Berlin being a classic example, how Berlin has been transformed through the huge flux of diaspora communities into the city since 2011. We also see that there's some very small sites that have attracted particular communities. And when we look at some of the impacts of this diversification, one of them is that we see, and this has always been true for diaspora politics, but conflict dynamics and homeland dynamics follow people into the diaspora. But with the sort of exacerbation of polarization and tensions and conflict, this has created situations where social gathering, casual social mixing has actually been rendered more difficult since 2011 across diasporas. But second, we also see that there are new forms of political remittances that have emerged, by which I mean the transfer of political ideas, norms, and practices. But interesting also new forms of multi-directional flows of political remittances. So it's not just people in diaspora are remitting politically towards the homeland. It's actually going the other way as well. We're having a two-way dialogue in transnational and translocal remittances. But we also see some very interesting dynamics of exchange going across different sites and also between different diasporic groups. Again, turning to Berlin, we have seen some very interesting forms of co-mobilization and co-engagement across different diasporic groups within the city of Berlin. So when we look at the types of mobilization, classic patterns of mobilization is specifically towards homelands and situations of conflict continue to exist. So lobbying host sites, host governments for increased humanitarian aid or sanctions, that continues to exist. But we also see some new forms of political activism. And just to talk about two, there's been huge efforts to document, to archive, to pursue justice for human rights abuses, for accountability, and seeing new forms of exchange that are connecting different sites. So connecting sites for the exchange of materials and documentation and utilizing the different access points in different sites in order to pursue justice. There's also been new forms of cultural engagement, whether this is efforts at heritage protection in the face of the destruction of conflict, new forms of cultural exchange, and actually some really interesting cultural revival movements that have emerged in diaspora since 2011. And the different factors that mediate these different forms of engagement are once again linked to the dynamics in the region in the post-2011. So we see, for example, that the relationship to the homeland the existing relationship, the anticipated relationship, the desire, all that ways, who decides to participate in various forms of mobilization or engagement and when. So just as one example, for those who perhaps are seeking to go back and are quite unsure of how conflict dynamics are going to fall in the end, that actually can be a factor that hinders mobilization, sort of a hedging risks. Better just to not engage because you don't know where those conflict dynamics, who is going to end up in power, and you don't want to sort of preclude in the capacity to go back. But we also see that the position, the generational position in diaspora has an interesting role in informing who mobilizes. Some of the research has shown, some very interesting research, that for those in the second generation or even third generation diaspora, the revolutionary moments of 2011 and 2019 have actually been a huge source of inspiration that has created new forms of identification to perhaps the parents or even the grandparents' homeland, people who maybe had never particularly identified with being Egyptian, for example, find themselves after 2011 much more inspired and much more interested in engaging and mobilizing in support of these revolutionary moments. A third factor with this diversification that can influence this mobilization process is the multiplication of political opportunity structures. I'm sure everyone in here knows about the triadic political opportunity structure, the opportunity structure in the country of origin, the host country, but also the geopolitical relationship between them. But with this diversification and multiplication of sites of diaspora, that creates many new opportunity structures that can be leveraged in different ways, but also that change as the dynamics in the region and these repeated reversals of power and of dynamics have shifted since 2011. And finally, the positionality of those and how that relates with political dynamics. By positionality, I mean social identity, ethno-sectarian identity, linguistic identity, location in the country, geographic point of origin in the country, how that interacts with these shifts in power dynamics can create different opportunities and constraints, different moments of empowerment and disempowerment for those in diaspora that can provide opportunities or constraints for engagement. So very briefly, just what are these changes, these transformations that we can sort of identify as differences in post-2011 diasporas? What do these imply in terms of future research questions? I cite 4 here. First, how are these spatial and sociopolitical dimensions of diversification, how are these informing the emergence of new identities? There can be this diversification as well of identity and identity formation processes linked to these spatial differences and sociopolitical differences. Second, how do these multi-directional flow of political remittances and cross-diaspora engagement, how is this informing new solidarities, and how can we understand these new solidarities, these new solidarity practices? Third is how is the different modes of engagement and the different ways of being a political actor, what is the relationship between that and different or expanded notions of citizenship and expanded practices of citizenship that maybe defy traditional definitions of citizenship as linked to a state or a certain territory? And finally, for those within social movement studies, we can do new investigations of outcomes and what is the role of the diasporic mobilization and these new forms of diaspora mobilization in influencing outcomes in terms of transitional justice, in terms of political change and nation and state building processes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I think this opens up to the first panel. So I will invite our panelists perhaps to come up and join me. We have Do I have both of them? All right, so this first panel is looking at new theoretical perspectives in post-2011 diasporas. So the aim is to add some theoretical depth and innovation to our understanding of diaspora politics. And I'm joined here by 2 panelists. We have Elise Ferron, who is a docent senior research fellow at the Tampere Peace Research Institute. She's been working on diaspora for over 15 years and has a specific interest in conflict-generated diaspora politics. And Gerasmos Tsourapas, who's a professor of international relations at the University of Glasgow. He works on international relations of the Middle East and broader global South, with a particular focus on politics of migrants, refugees, and diasporas. So in terms of the format, we're asking the panelists to speak at the podium. So you'll each have about 20 minutes I will be keeping time, but I'll just show you a little sign of the 5-minute, 1-minute mark, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And these, if you have, sorry, I didn't, we're just going sorter.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I want to start by saying that I feel very honored to be here and very happy, and I want to thank the organizers for having me. And I want to also start with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert at all on Arab diasporas, so I will be, of course, giving some examples from the Arab world, but my take is mostly theoretical, and I look at what has happened since 2011 from mostly a theoretical perspective. Yeah, is this, yeah, okay. So, I don't know, yeah. So anyway, so in this presentation, I will try to highlight a bit the main theoretical advances or the main points that have been made in the literature since 2011. And as you know, there has been like a lot of literature published since 2011. So I'm going to be like very generalizing maybe. So, okay, where should I point? Okay. Yeah, I hope you can still read. It's a bit, it's not very clear, but I hope you can still read at the back. So that literature that we have that has been produced since 2011 focuses a lot on, I would say, conflict-related activities of diasporas from the Arab world. So looking, for instance, at their regime change activities or peace-building activities and so on and so forth. And in parallel, there has been, I would call it like an oscillation between a theoretical stance on quote unquote their hybrid nature. So for instance, saying, oh, within the diaspora, so that's the complexity that Sarah was already mentioning. You have peace wreckers and peacemakers in the diaspora. So there has been like a lot of. At the same time, there has been, I think, a very limited kind of focus on their bilateral relations to conflicts and also to their situation in countries of residence. However, in parallel, there's still a lot of talk, and also Sarah mentioned it already, about the complexity of internal diaspora politics and cleavages. But this, I mean, this hasn't been really taken into account in frames of analysis. So there's like a lip service to saying about that actually when at least this is my my feeling. And in my view, what has happened since 2011, both empirically and theoretically, has demonstrated 3 elements that need to be factored in more in diaspora studies. And I will structure my presentation around these 3 factors to diaspora politics and the fact that they intervene, you know, in different, they can intervene, and sometimes they do intervene at several levels at the same time. The second point I want to talk about is how this impacts relations between diasporas and states, and further complicates diaspora politics and especially internal diaspora dynamics. And third, I want to talk briefly about the emergence of new forms of diasporic engagement and transnational solidarities. It will also follow up from on Sarah's points. So first, I want to talk a bit about diasporas as multi-positional hybrid actors. So, and I want to start with this famous triadic political opportunity structures concept developed by Chaudhary and Moss, which is very, very useful because it really allows us to understand diaspora politics as the result of this interaction between the conditions in the countries of settlement, the politics and, you know, the regime in the countries of origin, and transnational interactions. And this, if you conceptualize diaspora politics within this framework, then you understand the ability of diaspora to engage in activism while navigating challenges such as securitization from the countries of settlement, but also assimilationist pressures, transnational repression, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, especially with regards to countries of origins and countries of residence. But I guess we are all aware of the fact that the situation in the country of origin, of course, impacts dramatically what diasporas can do and cannot do. I know that Gerasimus will talk about this later, so I'm not going to go into this. But I want also to say that we tend to focus on the negative, but sometimes, you know, when there are regime transitions or democratic transitions, for instance, in the countries of origins, this opens avenues for intervention by the diasporas. It's not just about financing, it's not just about remittances like funding, it's also about sometimes they return to participate directly, and I think you mentioned it as well. I was thinking also about the example of Rachid Ghannouchi, for instance, in Tunisia, who came back from the UK and you know, to participate directly in the politics in Tunisia. So that is, of course, very important, but relatedly, of course, the politics in the countries of settlement are very important. Of course, the assimilation strategies, but I'm thinking especially about the securitization policies in countries of settlement, which might have like a very deep impact on diaspora politics. But also conversely, sometimes countries of residence are very supportive of diaspora activism. So they can provide funding, for instance, they can protect legally the diaspora activists and so on and so forth. So it's not black and white, if you want, and it very much depends on which country you are settled in. So you cannot talk, for instance, about, I don't know, the activism of the Palestinian diaspora, you know, in a blanket way. As we were also mentioning earlier, you have to think about whether it's in the US or whether it is in Germany or in France and so on and so forth. So what has happened since 2011 has also, I think, highlighted the importance of diaspora political entrepreneurs. So all of those things don't happen, you know, out of thin air. They are the results of the diaspora entrepreneurs' actions who play a key role in those networks. So, for instance, supporting NGOs in the countries of origin, or you know, sending money, but also sometimes lobbying the governments in their countries of residence. On the top of that, there are some factors that influence diaspora politics that are not much talked about, but I think that are very important. One of them is the importance of the... And what I mean by this is, what are the relations between the country of settlement and the country of origin? Do they have dual nationality agreements? Do they have repatriation schemes, for instance? And all of this, of course, impacts diaspora activism. And very interestingly, it's not much talked about, but I think in the case of, since the Arab Spring, we saw that that had a very important role. Of course, we also have to talk about the influence of major international events for understanding diaspora activism. For instance, of course, October 7. Of course. And it really shows that diasporas do not just mobilize around what happens in their countries of origin or their countries of residence, but also more broadly around what happens in world politics and you know, topics they are interested in. Of course, also, we have to talk about the role of transnational civil society organizations, like, I don't know, international federations, or, I don't know, the World Social Forum as a place where diasporas can meet and discuss. So in a way, I think the concept of triadic opportunity structures, it sounds a bit, you know, conventional to talk about this, but I think it's really useful for understanding the different forms, the different contexts, and the different outcomes of diaspora mobilizations, and how diasporas navigate, you know, these different structures, and how they, I will come back to that in conclusion, how they upscale and downscale their activities depending on the context. So if it's tight at the international level, they will move down to the local. If it's complicated at the local level, maybe they will get transnational, and so on and so forth. So this ability to move across scales, I think, is quite new when we think about diaspora activities. The second main point I wanted to make, okay. It doesn't want to. Ah, okay. So the second main point I wanted to make is how this multi-level nature of diaspora activism impacts state-diaspora relations. And I think that the relationship between diasporas and states have been redefined, but not in a straightforward fashion. It's complicated, and things are increasingly complicated because on the one hand, of course, we have diasporas that are increasingly securitized by their countries of origin and also by their countries of settlement, but also sometimes they are considered as assets. So we can oppose, for instance, I don't know, the authoritarian regimes in Egypt or Syria, which have intensified transnational repression. We're going to hear more about this soon. But at the same time, there are states like Morocco who have, sought to co-opt their diasporas and to promote their remittances, try to have them visit home, and things like that. And in parallel, we have securitization processes in countries of settlement, such as counter-extremism programs, de-radicalization programs, border surveillance, etc., etc. And those surveillance and securitization policies have targeted disproportionately Arab diasporas. That's pretty clear. And that those measures have criminalized political activism of Arab diasporas in a very clear way by associating them with extremism and sometimes even terrorism. And that has deterred participation in protests, that has deterred participation in advocacy or even in solidarity campaigns. And so all of this has had complex consequences. Not all are negative. For instance, among the positive consequences, we can see, and Sarah again spoke a bit about this, the emergence and the assertion of new political identities, right? Especially among second generation diasporas, but sometimes first generations as well. And this identity formation, if you wish, often intersects with activism, and that creates hybrid forms of belonging that influence both local and transnational politics, so from the local level to the transnational level. And we can see also that the uprisings and the parallel securitization in countries of settlement have fostered a sense of solidarity, a new sense of solidarity among diasporas. So between, but also within diasporas. So we've seen diasporas that were not really mobilized before that suddenly became mobilized. Like for instance, the Egyptian diaspora, I think we have in France in particular, they've become really mobilized. And also, as Sarah mentioned again, a solidarity between diasporas around certain causes. So those are rather like positive consequences, if you want. But at the same time, we've also had different consequences that are less positive or that complicate the activism of diasporas. For instance, the fact that because of securitization, diasporas have had to move to more indirect forms of engagement at times. So for instance, knowledge production, lobbying for policy changes in the host countries or on the transnational scene, participating in transitional justice initiatives and so on and so forth. And that's very interesting again, and because we see the agility of diasporas here again, because it means that then suddenly they can use those different topics and different forums in order to navigate securitization, in order to navigate repression policies. So they maintain their influence, but maybe in different fields or maybe in different forums or at different levels, if you want. But definitely on the negative side, securitization has also complicated solidarity campaigns by stigmatizing certain causes. I think that has been quite evident in the case of the Palestinian activism, which are still today seen sometimes as security threats. And that has led diasporas to adopt, again, different strategies. Okay, maybe we won't organize a public demonstration, but that we will move to do something else. Maybe, a legal strategy or a very grassroots campaign, for instance, in order to counter that. Okay, this really doesn't like me. Can you please, yeah, thank you. But at the same time, okay, I'm going to go quickly. Another thing that these securitization processes have led to is, well, not just securitization, but all these political processes have led to is processes of conflict transportation within diaspora communities. So basically where you have divisive politics from countries of origin which are imported or reproduced abroad. So for instance, in the Syrian diaspora, which as I am sure you know is very divided. And conflict transportation has been reinforced by securitization in countries of residence because it has amplified ideological and political differences within the diaspora. And that has led to a fragmentation of Arab diasporas, and therefore it has reduced the impact of their collective mobilization because they don't speak as a unified voice, but they also speak more diverse voices. So as a result, we can see that diasporas are increasingly having multiple roles. So they are peace builders, mediators, but they can also be, conflict transmitters and contributing to conflict. So it really underscores the complexity of diaspora politics, but it also shows their resilience. It shows their ability to move from one task to the next and from one position to the next. Okay. The last main point I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to go very quickly because there is a panel on this afternoon, is how new forms of engagement have emerged post 2011, or maybe not so much new forms, but in the sense that what we see are diasporas engaged in so many different things at the same time. Right? Whereas previously you had diaspora organizations, for instance, which used to be focusing on one type of activity, for instance, lobbying the host country government or organizing demonstrations or something like this. And now what we see is that they combine direct strategies such as lobbying, funding, financial support for political parties, protesting, being involved in national dialogues and so on and so forth. And they combine all that with indirect political engagement, such as I mentioned already, knowledge production and knowledge sharing, advocacy for transitional justice, and so on and so forth. It's also interesting to see that the Arab uprisings have really triggered the mobilization of previously politically inactive people in the diaspora. It has pushed them to re-engage with their communities, with their home countries, sorry. And all of this has been made possible by the use of digital platforms for diaspora activism. I'm not going to go into the details of what they do because we're going to talk about this this afternoon, but it has really been important, especially for dissidents. For instance, Algerian dissidents in France have been using social media a lot and digital platforms a lot to make their movements visible despite repression in Algeria. And the increase in the influence of these digital platforms and the diversification of diasporic media since 2011 has really allowed Arab diasporas to create what I can call diasporic public sphere. I'm using here the concept developed by Laguerre, where you have different people intervening, and that's really interesting to see. It's not just regular refugees or members of diaspora. It's also people like journalists. It's also people like policymakers, sometimes activists in NGOs, and so on and so forth. And the interactions within these diasporic public spheres blur the roles, the roles that were well established before. This person can do this person can do that, and so on and so forth. And just to finish on this, so we can describe increasingly a trend towards diasporas being cultural brokers. And that has been really evident since 2011. We see diasporas living in Western countries, for instance, translating what happened or what is happening in their countries of origin to a broader audience in their countries of residence and maybe transnationally as well. And that allows them to, so for instance, they will document government abuses, they will document, they will share protest videos and things like that. And that really allows them to broaden, their influence and broaden their impact. And all of this has facilitated the emergence of new political identities among Arab diasporas. And I'm not talking here about conflict transportation or things like this. I'm talking about the fact that what we see among diaspora activists in particular are a lot of discussions, sometimes theoretical, around human rights, around racism, around the legacy of colonialism, for instance. And these debates have nothing to do either with what's happening in the countries of residence or with what's happening in the countries of origin. It's something completely new. So they develop transnational awareness, if you want, which is really interesting to look at. And also what I really find interesting, and Sarah mentioned it earlier, is the fact that what we see since 2011, it's really that people who mobilize around, for instance, I'm going to take the obvious case of Palestine. People who mobilize around Palestine are not necessarily Palestinians, right? So what we see is through the activism of diaspora, people, not necessarily activists, but it can be like, normal people in diasporas, that the circles of engagement have, enlarged, and they now include people who have no connection whatsoever, for instance, with Palestine. They might not be Muslim, they might never have been in Palestine, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting to see how this changes the borders, if you want, of diaspora mobilization. Okay, I'm late, I have to conclude. So to me, there are four main points that we need to take out from all of this. The first is really this increased ability of diasporas to move across and scales and to act across scales. It's really interesting to see how agile diasporas have become. They upscale or they downscale their activities depending on the context, if it's repressive or not, depending on the issue at hand. And this is an agility that did not exist before, or not, at least not at that level, if you want. And as a consequence, diaspora politics are more and more complex in terms of forms and spaces of engagement. And I think this really should encourage all of us to fight against simplification and essentialization. More than ever, we have to embrace complexity when we want to try to understand diaspora politics. And of course, the internal divisions within diasporas are more obvious than ever. And they explain these seemingly contradictory interventions in terms of peace and conflict. Like at the same time, one diaspora might be supporting peace-building activities and conflict increasing activities. And finally, I think that the inclusion of new actors and new themes in diasporic public spheres, diasporic spaces, if you want, means that the borders of diaspora mobilization and diaspora politics are more blurred than ever. And I think that this might mean for at least me as researcher, but I think for all of us in this room, that we need new methods and new tools to analyze this, because it goes beyond the concept of diaspora might be maybe too constrained to understand really what's happening when we are looking at diaspora mobilization. Thank you.
Too short for this. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to CAREP and thank you to the Arab Reform Initiative for inviting me to this wonderful conference and this very timely event as well. I will talk for about 15 minutes on state-diaspora relations, which is my area of expertise, and in particular, what I call new theories, old regimes, Arab diasporas and authoritarian politics after 2011. So I was kindly invited here to offer a bit of a reflection in terms of whether 2011 is a turning point in terms of how we think and how we theorize in terms of state-diaspora relations in the Arab context. So I'll offer some reflections on this and say first off that, of course, 2011 is a critical juncture in terms of what has happened to diaspora politics, as you no longer have found out from these two great talks already. We're talking about new actors, we're not talking about new spaces, we're talking about novel practices and strategies. At the same time, however, I'll use my 15 minutes to try to convince you that there is a distinct continuity here, that we're not really reinventing the wheel, that a lot of the things that we see today happening across the Arab world and beyond, given the diaspora context, can be very much linked to previous practice, 2011, and in fact, going back quite a few decades before. In other words, if we take a state-centered perspective, state strategies remain the same, or rather state goals remains the same in terms of what kind of politics they want and how they want to engage with their citizens, fortunately or not. So in other words, it might be a, what's the plus à sens, plus le même chose kind of situation in terms of a lot of these contexts. Let's see if my attempt works here. No, it doesn't. I work on state level policy. So my interviews are usually with elites, with policymakers, with stakeholders. So I don't really work with migrants or diaspora members per se in terms of evidence. Yet I wanted to start with this quote from a Syrian diaspora member living in Sweden after 2011 and who had traveled for an opposition conference in Turkey. This is something published by a colleague of mine 9 years ago. And the Syrian says, there were 150 of us isolated at a hotel for a Syrian opposition conference in Turkey. And those Syrian diaspora members were the only ones there. And the hotel itself had been sealed off for security by the Turkish police. On my way pro-regime slogan used by regime supporters, and they had scribbled this on the elevator mirror. And the Syrian diaspora person concludes they are everywhere. And I often think of this quote whenever I try to talk about state-diaspora relations in the Arab context. And I think this brief kind of snippet gives us a lot of food for thought on a number of issues that have been raised earlier as well. One has to do, for instance, with the fragmentation of the term diaspora, right? So in the Arab context, there is no unitary Arab diaspora, there is no unitary Syrian diaspora. But even more, what this quote tells us is that it's really not a matter of a cleavage between pro-regime and anti-regime diaspora members. This can be much more complex. So we don't really know who scribbled this. We can talk about diaspora members that have tried to infiltrate opposition groups. We can talk about diaspora members that are patriotic and try to do this. So this kind of anti and pro-regime cleavage does not really explain everything about Syrian diasporas, let alone Arab diasporas. A second point that was raised by Elise has to do with mobilization, perhaps, and what this can tell us about how diasporas mobilize. And how we need to take into account new ways through which the state tries to reach out to its diaspora communities and what this means for diasporic mobilization. If you put yourselves in the perspective of this Syrian person living in Sweden, well, how do you continue mobilize if you go to an opposition conference and you really don't know who's your friend, who's your enemy, who's spying on you? This creates this kind of really intense feelings of uncertainty, to say the least, that really impacts Syrian diaspora mobilizations in ways that we need to take into account. I said that I'm an expert on state politics, so I focus on state politics. So from the state perspective, what we see here, if we look at the Syrian state, in a way, this has happened for a long time, right? The Syrian regime trying to infiltrate opposition events, trying to break up opposition groups. But this was used to happen domestically. So we see this transnationalization of anti-regime strategies by the Syrian regime in a way, though, that adds a level of uncertainty here. So we don't know who scribbled that thing in the elevator. We don't know whether they're being paid by the regime, whether they're informants, whether they're patriots, quote unquote. So we don't know about this. And this level of confusion and uncertainty is something that has been a strand of Arab diaspora mobilization since 2011. And finally, also from the host state perspective, right? This is something that is not taking place in Syria. This is something taking place in Turkey. So how is Turkey to respond to something like this, right? Should Turkey respond or should it not respond? And this kind of how do we respond question has been part of this discussion in terms of Western countries, Western European countries and North American countries ever since. How does Germany, France, the UK, the United States, how do they respond to state attempts at silencing or controlling diaspora groups abroad? How do we reconcile these actions with the liberal democratic norms that govern the states? And also, how do we take into account the fact that inaction sometimes also ends up supporting this kind of transnational repression practices? So Sarah talked about Berlin. We can have a long conversation about how Arab diasporas in Berlin have to navigate very tricky aspects of transnational repression and control from a range of actors. So we can talk about this if you want. Oh, it works. Great. So essentially what so let's not keep the introduction going for too long. I'll talk about this. How have the Arab uprisings reshaped understandings of diaspora politics in the Arab world and beyond? And I'll argue that what we see is significant transformations. Autocratic tools remain very consistent. So there are patterns of legitimation, repression, and co-optation. This is something that I looked at in terms of the domestic politics of authoritarian regimes in Egypt and beyond, but their application has evolved. Their application has evolved in terms of increased transnational activism and the pressures of globalization. So what I argue is that advancement in technology and global interconnectedness has shifted the dynamics because it has added to the capabilities of authoritarian states. While at the moment also increasing and heightening the salience of diaspora communities in terms of how they're shaping, but also how they're being shaped by the Arab uprisings. So I structure my work from a different perspective here, going back to James Holyfield and his concept of the migration state, who back some over 20 years now, gosh, has argued that liberal democracies have this tension in managing migration, what he calls a liberal paradox in terms of how they want to allow more immigrants into the state for distinct political benefits, but they also want to restrict immigration because of security and political concerns. So there is this tension, right? So how many people do you admit into a country, and how do you balance your economic need for migration versus your security need for controlling your borders? And this is something that we see up until today, be it in Western Europe, North America. And we've written with Fiona on this, and we argued that Holyfield's argument does appear centered on a global North context, of course, in terms of immigration and liberal democracies, but can also hold promise for broader theorizing. And this is what I'm doing in this talk, talking not about a liberal paradox, but a version of an illiberal paradox in terms of Arab states, or in particular Arab authoritarian countries of origin. So much like Western democracies face this dilemma about immigration, I argue that authoritarian states face this dilemma in terms of emigration, in terms of their own citizens trying to leave the country. And there's still a dilemma between the economics of this and the politics. So economically, a lot of Arab states would like to see their people leave for a number of reasons: reducing unemployment, heightening remittances, getting trained and producing skills abroad, and so on and so forth. At the same time, they want to minimize immigration because of political and security risks. Because if they allow everybody to leave the country, then the risk of anti-regime diasporic activism heightens. So how do they square off this illiberal paradox? Looking back to the 20th century, we see that Arab autocracies or autocratic states prioritized politics over economics here. So in other words, they sought to restrict the movement of citizens. So they had all sorts of legal, procedural, practical obstacles to emigration. A number of states had blacklists of political dissenters that were not allowed to leave the country. Or we see also the denaturalization of migrants that chose to leave the country without authorization. So they would prioritize the politics of this over economics. More recently, we see that globalization drove mass migration and also increased the risks of dissent from abroad. So what I argue is that autocracies in the Arab world have recalibrated. They no longer appear to prioritize politics over economics, but they try to find a way to square the two. In other words, to pursue a win-win strategy in which they both reap the economic benefits of migration while aiming to minimize any kind of security risk from people leaving the state. In other words, what we see is this long arm of the Arab state that I argue creates transnational practices of legitimation, repression, and co-optation. And this is what I'll talk about for a few minutes. Transnational repression is perhaps the most obvious way through which state diaspora politics has been shaped in the last few years. And we're talking here about mechanisms that suppress dissent and silence critics abroad. One way would be going from least harsh to most harsh, perhaps the use of surveillance. So the use of embassy networks in Western Europe, in North America, to monitor and to spy on diaspora members, digital spyware, informants as well that monitor diaspora activity and report back. Coercion by proxy, we're looking at ways through which regimes that are unable to reach diasporic individuals end up threatening family members of those citizens abroad in order to compel their silence. Enforced disappearances, we also have forcible abductions of individuals without any kind of legal discourse, and of course, even lethal retribution in terms of a number of people. So we see that repression, whereas in the past used to be quite limited in terms of the sovereign territorial boundaries of the Arab state, is now increasingly able to cross these boundaries and reach people living in liberal democracies in the West and elsewhere. Dana will speak virtually later on, so she can tell a lot about her work on this in terms of the Syrian diaspora and how transnational repression works there. Iraq, Will is here, so Iraq historically has also done this quite efficiently, employing embassy networks and informants to monitor and intimidate expatriates. So we have a lot of threats to exile families back home in order to silence opposition abroad. The repression might be the most obvious way through this works, if I manage to change this. Oh, of course. Sorry. Yes, and Libya. I'm currently involved in an ERC project out of Cyprus, and we're looking at Libyan transnational repression. And one of the very interesting things that comes out of there is that, of course, Gaddafi used to engage in transnational repression quite heavily, assassination of dissidents in Europe, and so on and so forth. What we uncover there is the extent to which these strategies travel back into the pre-independence colonial era as well. So we see how transnational repression actually has ties to French counterinsurgency tactics, but also Italian tactics in Libya. So we can talk about this if you care. If you want to talk about this in the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss this. Beyond transnational repression, what we see also in the next slide, if you don't mind. Brilliant. Issues of legitimation. So softer ways through which transnational control is expanded to strengthen authority abroad. We look at efforts that promote regime stability by enhancing its image abroad amongst diaspora communities and host nations. So what do we see? One of the obvious ways through which this happens is patriotic outreach. So a number of states, particularly Maghrebi states in the past, have organized events that foster national identity, cultural festivals, National Day celebrations, while emphasizing loyalty to the homeland. And this is a fascinating aspect in terms of state diaspora politics in the Arab world, because it's a very cost-effective way to figure out who's pro-regime and who's anti-regime. So most evidently, in terms of who shows up to these events, be it in the Paris consulate of Tunisia or the Algerian embassy in Berlin, and who doesn't. And when they do show up, who's more sympathetic to this and more enthusiastic, and who isn't? So this is something that has been a very good way of essentially thinning out the diaspora in terms of who's pro-regime and who's anti-regime, but also how it is able to instrumentalize more patriotic diasporas. So what we see is a lot of diaspora groups, loyal diaspora groups, being mobilized to counter oppositional networks by targeting exiled dissidents with nationalist rhetoric. And this is something I work on Egypt. We see quite a lot in terms of the Egyptian context in the UK and beyond. And of course, a perennial issue here has to do with the framing of exile as treason. So exile not as an act of agency, not as an attempt to escape repression, but as treasonous to the nation, right? Whatever that is. This delegitimization of opposition by framing exile as traitors. Algeria has done this historically. The story of the Amicale des Algériens en France is well known. Tunisia as well, I don't want to go. Saudi Arabia more recently, of course, trying these image building campaigns aimed at reframing the kingdom's global narrative. And finally, co-optation in terms of the use of diaspora members into state projects in order to neutralize opposition and gain economic and political advantages. We talked about this briefly before, but what we see here is a number of states. Can you help me? Oh, brilliant. Engaging in patronage, so rewarding loyalty with benefits like government positions or economic incentives. A number of states reaching out to their diaspora communities rather than local communities in order to essentially co-opt them into a range of practices at the domestic level, and cultivating influential diaspora members to act as intermediaries or brokers. El Sayed is here, so he might talk about Egypt at some point, but Egypt under Mubarak did this quite effectively in terms of organized trips, conferences to loyal diaspora or successful diaspora Egyptians abroad, effectively targeting wealthy expatriates. This is all part of this long arm of the Arab state abroad in order to reward patriotic diaspora members at the expense of non-patriotic ones, and Morocco as well. I don't have much time. Last slide. Moving forward, what I'm hoping to have convinced you about is that this is an area that has a number of emerging challenges and new areas for research. One that Elise and Sarah have hinted at, and I think will be a recurring theme here, is this fragmentation of Arab diasporas. That they're not homogeneous, of course, but they're also fragmented, not because of what they themselves do, but how these sending states or countries of origin engage with them via repression, via co-optation, or via legitimation. What we see, of course, also is AI and internet communication technologies coming in to enhance surveillance tools, to enable also a diasporic resistance in reshaping transnational political dynamics. We see the effect of multinational corporations, which is something we haven't talked about, but I see it quite a lot in terms of the Gulf, in terms of how multinational corporations recruit labor into the Gulf and how they're quite potent in terms of facilitating transnational authoritarianism. And I think I have the final, yes. International organizations is something we can also have a think about, not merely in terms of international organizations' capacity to mediate state diaspora relations or to enable repression, to mitigate repression, but also sometimes as enablers of transnational repression. Turkey is one example here, and there's been work done on how Turkey has been using Interpol, for instance, of all organizations, in order to identify and to bring back diaspora members involved in political activism abroad via the use of warrants, international warrants issued by Interpol. So there is something to be said about the interaction between international organizations and the sending state. And finally, the role of host states, right? This is a big black hole in terms of this, in terms of how us living in France or Western Europe or North America, how do our governments protect migrant and diasporic communities within their territories, and perhaps how our inaction sometimes ends up facilitating modes of transnational repression and control. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Hello.
Okay, thank you very much. Those were incredibly dense, which is really exciting. So there's a lot of things we get to unpack now. I believe we have about almost 20 minutes for the Q&A. And I don't know how we're managing for those that are online, but I already see a question right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ruba. Thank you for the very interesting beginning, Sarah, and also the very informative presentations. I think they put everything in perspective, so it's a nice start to the day. I have a question actually, since listening to both presentations, I was asking myself, and then I thought of sharing the question with you, maybe to hear what you think. The issue of mobilization, diasporic mobilizations at the host countries towards rights in the host countries, rights of these diasporic groups. Now we can say that, for example, in the case of the Syrian diasporic communities, the issue was they were trying to integrate and advocate for discourses related to integration, solidarity, and so on. And now it has been a decade in a way, and things changed. We've seen, for example, doctors in Germany integrated in the workflow. So they have presence, maybe forming coalitions. I'm not talking about doctors alone, but also other side, maybe in food business, in other businesses, integrating. So they might be the time now for them to start advocating for better rights, like the Turkish community in Germany, and so on and so forth. However, what happened was a turning point where return migration is a new aspect to be considered. So I see the migrant in a way on the crossroad between advocating for new rights and new citizenship roles, and then also advocating for a better living in Syria, for example, when returning. So how do you reflect on this, on how have the diasporic communities involved in enhancing their situation in the host countries? And then with this turning point, do you see it bringing it backward, this advocation process, or is it strengthening them? I quote a guy who just arrived to the Netherlands from Syria. He had taken all his money with him, and then 10 days the regime was knocked down. So he was like, okay, what do I do now? I lost everything. So this paradox is very important.
Okay, maybe we'll take, if there's any other questions, maybe take a round of questions. Anyone else? Yes. Okay, Thomas and then Asai.
Thank you for a very rich morning opening to this discussion. I would like you to expand a bit on the 2011 paradigm and compare it to a 2023 paradigm. What are the similarities and differences between that? You alluded a bit to it, but can you expand a bit on that? To what extent will we talk about a 2023 paradigm also in diaspora studies later on?
Thank you. Thank you for both interesting presentations. I actually have an add-up or a follow-up question here to the first one, to Erasmus mainly, because I agree with you about that. It's like these kind of measures are actually well established from a state perspective, and they are developing over time, starting from the colonial era. But the confusion I faced during my fieldwork, basically, that many people, especially emerging migrants. They are busy about establishing themselves, their economies, how they earn money, livelihood, and then starting or continuing their politics. They are not aware of these kind of already established measures and already established infrastructures and the faster evolving infrastructure against them. And this creates a paradox of how like they are trying to reach something that basically they can never reach, to see state perspective, etc., and how to deal with it, you know?
To answer first.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. Thanks for the questions. I mean, the question about the mobilization around rights in countries of residence is very interesting. What I witnessed, but as I said before, I'm not an expert on Arab diasporas, but what I've witnessed with other diaspora groups is that it's not, we tend as researchers to oppose mobilization for diasporic rights in countries of residence to mobilization in favor of the country of origin. In practice, they are not. Many of the organizations that are, the diasporic organizations, they do both actually at the same time or sometimes at different times. Because as I was trying to explain during the presentation, the diaspora organizations are increasingly agile. So they will change their focus, they will change even their targets, depending on the context and the needs. So if there is a big need to push for migrants' rights, then they will do it. But if there is something, important happening in the country of origin, then they will move to that as well. So I don't think we should, I think we really should not oppose both. And there are studies, for instance, by Jean-Michel Lafleur, I think, showed that the people who invest in their countries of origin tend to be also very mobilized on domestic, issues in the countries of settlement. So we shouldn't be like opposing them too strictly. Yeah, and usually it's, of course, it was also hinted in your question. I mean, it's also related to the positionality of these organizations. So if their members don't have, for instance, papers, if they are undocumented, or if they are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, then it will create issues. There will be, I call it the survival mode. You need to survive in the country of settlement, and so you don't necessarily have the mind space, to actually be involved in other causes. Thomas, your question on 2011, 2023 paradigm, you speak about October 7, right? When you're saying this, I think there is some sort of parallel. I think there are similarities, but I would say that October 7 has a more global type of impact. At least this is my reading, and it. Okay. I think there are several authors who've spoken about Palestine as the first global or globalized conflict. And I think that I was discussing this at breakfast actually with Nora, and it's very interesting to see that Palestine is a cause that mobilizes everybody everywhere. Although, for instance, the Syrian revolution or the Tunisian or the Egyptian uprisings, they have mobilized among the Arab diasporas. They don't have the capacity to divide whole societies well beyond the diasporas themselves that the case of Palestine has. So there is, I think, a difference in that sense, because it changes the general context in which diasporas actually operate and develop their activism. I don't want to talk too much.
Does it work? Thank you. No, just 2 quick points on El Sayed's point on migrants coming to Europe and diaspora politics there. I think it has to do, from my work on Egypt, right? I can tell you this and we can discuss more. The extent to which the difficulty of attaining this journey of making it over to Europe or North America is so difficult nowadays for an ordinary Egyptian that it becomes romanticized in a way, in the sense that once you make it there, you're like, oh, you're a permanent migrant now, right? You've made it. You're done with the Egyptian regime. But what we're trying to do is that, well, you may be done with the Egyptian regime, but the regime is not done with you, right? So it goes back to the point raised at the very beginning that what is our responsibility as researchers, and whether our research actually produces any kind of useful outcomes for diaspora community themselves. And perhaps this can be one, in terms of the varied ways through which the sending states, if you want to call them that, continue to engage with you, even when you really don't want to have anything left to do, anything to do with them. And that brings me to the question on protesting in terms of pro-rights and whatnot. For me, it links very much to questions of divides across age. So in my understanding, it has to do with essentially first-generation diasporas versus second-generation diasporas, what kind of things they want, what kind of protest activity are they used to engaging with in the country of origin versus a European or North American country as well, essentially. And the risk of depoliticization, I think, is very high across this issue. But to make it more concrete, I was in Amsterdam right before Christmas for another workshop there. And it was a time of the Israeli, if you remember, the Israeli football stuff and all this horrible stuff going on. And the extent to which the state was going after second generation and third generation Arabs there, and the threats of deportation. I mean, we're talking pro-rights for first generation. I mean, you know, even people that have been born in the Netherlands, have never traveled to the Middle East, they were suddenly saying, oh, we don't go out at night because we don't know what's going to happen. So I think the conversation is even more complex than this in a way. Sorry to end at such a bad.
We also have a question over Zoom. Probably goes more to Gerasimos. Could you explain a bit more about increased control through surveillance technology with AI, and who are the states in the Middle East that use this kind of technology? And there was also a question here.
It's not a question, but observations. In Sweden, it's a very specific case. It's comparative to Latin America concerning the Syrian, because we have all the diaspora, Syrian diaspora in Sweden, who I don't like to talk about religion, but it's transparency, who come from the Assyrian and Syriac community. And unfortunately, they are under the propaganda of the regime of their families. For that, the opponent in Sweden have in front of them a huge community from Syria who supported Assad. Not more anymore. Now they will make more supported Sharia than the revolutionary. But this case need a specific study, I think. And second observation that the extreme right in Austria, they said that all the Syrians who show their happiness in the street of Vienna must go back to Syria. It's a new way to discuss with diaspora community, and I think all the extreme right in the Arab and Europe, even in Arab world, because the extreme right now it's dominated everywhere, will reproduce the same sentence. If you are happy, go back to your country.
Nadim, sorry, just.
Thank you very much for getting us started on how to kind of theorize this post-2011 Arab diasporas. So the question I have, I mean, it seems there's unanimity, the complexity, the fragmentation, sort of the online spaces and so forth. I'm wondering if there's been any work done on how reconceptualizing how all these constraints and opportunities, fragmentation, online spaces, generational practices, and so forth, have manifested themselves in how diasporas try to organize themselves. You know, I mean, all of us know the sort of model of organization of diasporas historically, right? That came out of the mass migration of 60s, 70s, and 80s, very sort of top-down, traditional sort of structures, and so forth. Has there been much work done on these new Arab diasporas and how they're trying to organize themselves, how they're trying to maybe organize practices of you know, maybe online, maybe in terms of legitimacy of representation of these diasporas? One thing that has struck me is this inability to go beyond the small pockets, you know, and even organizationally. So there are initiatives, they're online, but they're, when actually I try to look back about a lot of these post-2011 diasporas, I can't think, organizationally speaking, of initiatives that have necessarily lasted. But I'm wondering if you've come across examples and if there's been any thinking about what this has entailed. Have we seen, for instance, examples of, I don't know, online voting for elections across countries? Crowdfunding. I mean, there's been some interesting examples, for instance, from Lebanon in terms of crowdfunding for certain initiatives. And it's interesting, it worked very well in the UK, it worked atrociously in France. And what does that say about cultures in both countries within the Lebanese diaspora and so forth?
Yeah, no, thank you. I would say that I'll start from the last question, and Elise can talk much more about this than I am. I think she's much more of an expert there. But I would say one of the problems there in terms of researching this and finding out how this works is that not only is the term fragmented in itself, but there's a lot of activism out there that I'm aware of that doesn't want to be called diasporic. So there's a lot of people coming out of Egypt, coming out of Syria, that say, no, we're exiles. Or this is not, we're not diaspora, we're something else, right? And this has to do with how, do we then feature them into our analysis of diasporic activism when they explicitly say, please don't call us diasporas? Or how do we deal with this, right? So I'm not answering your question precisely, but this is another issue of complexity here that is interesting. To the Zoom, the online question, what's happening is a process of diffusion of these practices of surveillance and the use of AI and internet and ICTs. I think Dana Moss has published an article just on this, so they can pick it up. The Pegasus software emerged out of Israel and has been picked up by a number of states in the Arab world. Syria has been accused of doing this quite a lot. The Saudis used to have this app, the Kulumna Am, the We're All Security kind of app, where you could also report on problematic individuals abroad. So it's less a matter of identifying 2 or 3 regimes, but looking at how these processes are diffused over time. And just very briefly on Sweden, yes, you're absolutely right. In terms of these cleavages from the older Syrian diaspora to the newer, I would also look at it from the state perspective in terms of how Sweden is really struggling to respond to all of this. I remember, I don't know if you're aware of that PhD dissertation on the Muslim Brotherhood that was produced by a PhD researcher in Sweden, and they ended up naming all the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sweden. And the Swedish state was like, what was going? So we're still struggling in terms of liberal democracies to respond to this. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, just very briefly on the new forms of engagement, I think Gerasimos is absolutely right. Most of this is not necessarily framed as diaspora activism. So what you see, what I've witnessed a lot among the diasporas I'm working on, like for instance, from the Great Lakes region of Africa, is that, for instance, they will mobilize against colonization, in favor of decolonization, and they will not necessarily refer it to their country of origin because it has a much broader, kind of frame, of course. So what you find in terms of the literature, what I've seen, at least, I've seen some case studies on, for instance, Syrian cultural brokers and, mediating information about the war in Syria in Sweden, for instance. So I've seen things like that, but I haven't seen any analysis, like theoretical, like broader analysis about these new forms of engagement. And I think this is really, it really goes back to what I finished my presentation with, which is that we need new tools, because what we are trying to capture with the concept of diaspora doesn't work if we want to capture this, because it extends, it expands, it goes beyond the borders of diaspora and also of conventional diaspora activism. So there's a new field out there that needs to be explored. Yeah.
Maybe one last question. I was wondering whether there is a kind of dialectic between, I don't know, in authoritarian states or in weak states, encouraging maybe people to actually emigrate, move away, and at the same time taking in new refugee communities, a little bit like Lebanon has done so far, because there's this issue also about financializing refugees and using them as a kind of way of attracting funds from abroad. I don't know whether you can elaborate a little bit on this and whether you see this as a dialectic perspective that is happening actually in the Middle East.
That's a great question, and we usually treat these two fields as separate, right? Refugee versus migration studies, but in actuality, when it comes to these regimes, particularly those that, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but those that don't recognize, that haven't signed the Refugee Convention and don't recognize refugees, this distinction doesn't really matter. Essentially. So there is, what would you call it? I guess a neoliberalization of the management of mobility that takes place, both in terms of how the state reacts to those that want to leave, but also those that want to come in. And again, we see multiple levels at play, as Elise was alluding to, sort of the country of origin coming into play with countries of destination or transit states. So it becomes quite messy at the end of the day. But I think it has to do with this kind of, would you call it, governmentality of mobility in a way that is becoming deeply neoliberal and more and less rights-based the more we continue.
All right. Well, I think that brings our first panel to its conclusion. Thank you very much to both of you.